Joining us now is Vivek Ramaswamy with his new book, Woke Inc. So let's put that beautiful graphic that we had made for the book there up on the screen. And this book, Woke Inc., debuted at #2 on the New York Times bestseller list. Marshall and I actually interviewed Vivek over at our podcast, The Realignment, and we wanted to make sure that we brought a little bit of this to the overall audience here. So Vivek, welcome to the show. It's really good to see you.
Good to see you again.
Yeah. So let's get into exactly what this book is all about. Why did you decide to write it? What exactly happened in the overall corporate sphere that made you want to do it? And maybe give the audience a little bit of background on who you are.
Yeah, I'll give you 2 minutes of background. My parents, probably like yours, came over from India over 40 years ago. They didn't come with much money to Southwest Ohio, where I was born, but they did come with an education. That's what I got. And though I wasn't born into elite America, I have lived it for the last 15 years. I went to Harvard, graduated at the top of my class in molecular biology in 2007, went to Yale Law School along the way. I was at a hedge fund for 7 years in New York as a biotech investor. I actually had, right before I started my company, I actually had a failed career as a stand-up comedian where I learned the lesson of anytime something really annoys you, you write it down in a notebook. Turned out it didn't serve me well in stand-up comedy in New York. It did serve me well on the job as an investor, where I wrote down all the things that annoyed me about pharma and instead started a pharmaceutical company based on what I wrote down in that notebook. So I did that for about 7 years, got a number of medicines developed, a couple of which I'm proud to say are with patients today as FDA-approved products. The one I'm most probably proud of is a drug for prostate cancer. But I kept jotting down things that annoyed me. And one of the things that started to really annoy me was the inauthentic proclamations made by my peers in business, in the investment world, fellow CEOs, that really reached a fever pitch in 2019 and then hit an even higher fever pitch in 2020. And so I authored an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal arguing that I thought that actually stakeholder capitalism represented a threat to the integrity of democracy itself. It was supposed to be a one and done. Instead, an agent approached me, told me to blow it out into a book. That's what I did. Eventually, that became Woke Inc. a year and a half later. But along the way, I started writing and speaking out about subjects that were increasingly controversial that I actually had to step down as CEO of my company in order to speak with total candor as a citizen. And what I do in the book is I reveal what I see as the defining scam of our century, where corporate elites in this country pretend like they care about something other than profit and power, precisely to gain more of each of them. And I think that new trend is dividing our country to a breaking point and represents an existential threat to American democracy because it demands that a small group of investors and CEOs determine what's important to us on questions from racial justice to environmental change, rather than the democracy at large, which is, I think, the premise on which our country was born. So that's what the book's about, and I'm happy to talk more about it.
Sure.
Yeah, Vivek, congratulations on #2. Now, I'm going to do my best Krystal impression here and just ask the obvious question that everyone on the left of this audience is asking, which is, what is here for us, right? Like the word woke is in the title. Once again, #2, so this really resonated with people, but I'm guessing that's more of a right-leaning audience. Why should people who are to the center and the left end of the political spectrum think that there is something useful for them here?
Yeah, sure. So first thing I should say is I'm not sure actually a lot of that was entirely driven by conservatives. I don't know for sure. I've been grateful actually for a lot of warm reception I've received from some thoughtful minds on the left as well. This was intended as a book both for the left and for the right. And here's why. I think both sides need to be skeptical of corporate overreach. And the good thing about the left is that that's actually been part of the left since the last 20 years, skepticism of corporate power. If you're on the left, you're skeptical of Citizens United because it permits corporations to influence elections through electoral contributions. Well, I think that stakeholder capitalism is actually Citizens United on steroids. It just doesn't permit companies to write a few checks to influence an election. It demands that corporations use every resource in their arsenal to be able to play a disproportionate role in our public debate about the most important questions that ought to be settled through our democracy. And to me, whether you're on the left or the right, that is not America. That is a corporatocracy, not a democracy. And while corporations may be pushing progressive values today, once they become vectors to push values, they become vectors to push anyone's values. And I think today we're actually even seeing that behind closed doors in how they are pushing, for example, the values of the Communist Party of China right here in the United States, again, in a way that should threaten both liberals and conservatives. And so what I describe in the book is this arranged marriage today between big business and a certain wing of the progressive left, what we could call the progressive identity politics focused left. Yet what we see is that both liberals and conservatives are duped into submission because of their own philosophies. Conservatives are actually duped into submission because their inner conscience tells them that the free market can do no wrong, without recognizing that the free market that they idealize doesn't actually exist today. I tell a lot of stories in the book about how companies are indirectly acting as agents of the state in ways that you don't see. But liberals are duped into submission because many of them love the causes that these companies happen to be pushing today, but they could be pushing different causes tomorrow. And the final story I'll say that I think is an important distinction for the left in this book is a distinction between what I think of as the Bernie left and the squad left, where I think what corporate America actually managed to do was to use the 2008 financial crisis and the aftermath as an opportunity to recover their impression in the minds of the public by marrying the new progressive identity politics focused left, the part of the left that says racial injustice is the problem, and put the part of Occupy Wall Street that said economic injustice was the real problem. What they did is they were able to put that up for adoption. That wing of the left is now stale. It's now neutered as big business has taken up the cause of racial injustice and fixing misogyny and bigotry. They've ultimately abandoned the project of actually focusing on economic empowerment and fixing economic injustice, which is something that I think the Bernie left and even a lot of the classical left overall ought to worry about. So that's a big part of what's in the book.
Vivek, one of the things I respect the most about your work is that you're not just, barking about woke politics or whatever. You're actually talking about the structural problems. You use the word stakeholder capitalism. Can you explain to people what that is? And then more importantly, what you get to in the book, how can you fix it? Like, what are the corporate fixes that we can have?
Yeah, sure. So stakeholder capitalism refers to the idea that corporations are bound to serve not just their shareholders, but also their stakeholders, which include basically all stakeholders in society, workers, disempowered minority groups, even the climate is now considered a stakeholder by many corporations. And agree or not, that's what the philosophy says. There's actually something really coherent about it, too. And I expose what I view as the strongest case for stakeholder capitalism in the book, which is that corporations couldn't have existed even in society without society giving corporations great gifts like limited liability. The idea that if you're a shareholder of a corporation, you are not liable for what that corporation does. If you think about that, that's an extraordinary gift that ordinary people don't enjoy in their everyday lives. Corporate shareholders do. And so what stakeholder capitalists argue is that in return for that grand bargain, you effectively expect that society gave corporations and their shareholders all these great gifts. All we're asking is that you take some societal interests into account in return. It sounds pretty reasonable. What I lay out in the book is actually a more precise view of the history of corporate law in this country that I think was long misunderstood. Even misunderstood, if I may say, by Milton Friedman himself, the first dogged opponent of stakeholder capitalism 50 years ago. And what Milton Friedman missed is that actually he never responded to that criticism. What I say is there actually is an obligation that corporations and their shareholders have to society, but it's a different one. It is to stay in their lane and not to use their undue power that they gain from gifts like limited liability to exercise power outside the market in other spheres of our lives, including in our democratic politics. And that's why corporate law mandates that directors of boards stay in their lanes and only maximize profits for shareholders, not just to help those shareholders, but to protect the rest of society from corporate overreach. And so that's what the heart of the debate about stakeholder capitalism is all about. It's also something I've tried to do in the book is to really offer the best argument, both for stakeholder capitalism as well as for the woke movement. I know that word has been weaponized recently and carries some connotations that have made it popular on the right and suddenly unpopular on the left. I think that woke culture posits a worldview that we ought to talk about in the open, giving its fairest shake, saying that actually the social universe is governed by certain invisible power structures that disempower certain people and empower others and result in injustices that we need to talk about by waking up to what those previously invisible power structures were. I think that's a worldview that a lot of people share. I think it's a worldview that has its origins in classical Marxism. And again, I don't use that as a pejorative. I actually think Marxism is an intellectually rich mode of inquiry that we ought to engage with in the present day. Now, I ultimately reject that narrative in part because I think it divides us. And I think what's happened right now in corporate America is a cynical marriage between that new woke philosophy and corporate America, where actually the stewards of that philosophy are themselves actually often leaving the very values they're advancing hanging out to dry. I tell an example of how State Street built a statue called Fearless Girl to represent feminism standing up against the Wall Street bull. Turns out they were actually just doing it at a time that their female employees were complaining that they weren't being paid as much as their male colleagues. And as I tell in the book, of course, what does a firm do when a female employee says she's not being paid enough as much as her male colleagues? They do the thing you'd expect. They built her a statue. And there's some funny further layers to the story I tell where they even sue the statue's creator for creating 3 unauthorized reproductions of that statue later on. So this is the kind of stories that I tell in the book that reveal how both sides are really harmed by this cynical arrangement.
My last question within the Krystal left channeling is basically, it's interesting how you're combining climate change stuff with traditional woke critiques as something that's the matter of the system. Because if I'm thinking about someone who thinks that, once again, we live in an era of a climate emergency and there's always big problems, government is utterly deadlocked right now. Nothing is happening. We're not going to see any big climate deal between the US and China. So one of the only actual means that a lot of people on the left see of exercising power or forward movement is through corporate behemoths, which aren't encumbered by gridlock in Washington, D.C. So what do you say to that argument?
Yeah, well, I say a couple of things. First, on the merits, which I don't want to touch on a ton here because there are even better people than I who can comment on the merits of where we stand in our progress towards achieving environmental change, environmental benefits that have nothing to do with climate change, as well as environmental benefits that could drive benefits in staving off climate change. I think another good book that came out pretty recently was Steve Koonen's book, Unsettled, which I think everyone ought to read as a side note. He was someone in the Obama administration, scientist, well-trained in the field, worth a read. Now, I think that the problem with corporate America getting in on the act is they have no incentives to actually solve the underlying problem. They have every incentive to signal their virtue along the way. If you look at the top polluting cities in the world in terms of not only pollution in general, but also contributions to the carbon footprint in a way that contributes allegedly to climate change, actually, almost all of them are not in the United States. And so I think that many corporations do nothing to be able to change their behavior abroad while pretending to signal their virtue here at home. And one of the principles I advance in the book, both with respect to climate change, the climate change-oriented behavior of corporations, as well as their behaviors on causes that relate to racial justice or conceptions of diversity, is that once as a corporation you have earned a reputation for goodness, at some point, your interest becomes in preserving the appearance of pursuing virtue rather than actually being a steward of virtue itself. And I think it is a lot easier to appear to be virtuous than it is to be virtuous. And I think that inherently, the nature of what a corporation is makes it a particularly bad steward. We cannot trust a corporation to do anything other than cultivate the appearance of goodness when they're ultimately rewarded for that appearance. And I think that increasingly what we're seeing is a lot of daylight between what it means to appear to be good and what it actually means to be good. Right. We can even debate what our conceptions of the good are. I think that's what the right and the left often differ on. But even if you had a steady conception of what the good is, the main case I'm making in the book is that inherently the nature of what a corporation is means we can't trust a corporation to be a steward of that. If we do, all we're going to solve for is actually optimizing for the corporation appearing to be a steward of the good. That's exactly what we've done in recent years.
Excellent point. Vivek, we really appreciate you joining us here on Breaking Points. We'll have a link down there in the description for everybody to buy the book. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks everybody for watching. Marshall, thank you for stepping in. He's going to be back on Tuesday. Remember, we're taking no show on Labor Day. We have really enjoyed being here with you guys today. If you can support us, the Supercast link is right there down in the description. We really appreciate it. It enables us to bring you all of the stories for the team that we have here and more. And it really is a privilege every single day to be able to do this show. It's been 3 months to the day since we officially went independent, announced it. I honestly can't even believe it. It's just been completely blown me away. I know Krystal feels exactly the same. So we appreciate your support so much, and we will see you. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and just one quick thing. Speaking for myself, really enjoy being here. But of course, if you enjoyed what Saagar and I are up to, go check out the Realignment podcast. We're on YouTube. We're about to cross 50,000. Let's get us there. Hopefully by the end of the weekend. But also we're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We have lots of great conversations like this.
Correct.
Would love for you all to check out what we're doing there.
100%. Okay, guys, we will see you all on Tuesday.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it, you get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.